started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray Huff. I'm the director of the Peninsula Design Center here, and I just wanted to welcome all of you who are here to hear a report on some of the work that's been done this week with the Dutch Dialogues team, the City of Charleston, and all the stakeholders who are involved. And to say, too, that this is the very reason why the Clemson Design Center is here, is to have this kind of collaborative, engaged work to make our community an even better one. So we were delighted to be the host of that, and we'll look to continue that role as this process moves forward. I'd also like to introduce Dr. B.D. Workman-Galvin, who is the director of our Resilient Urban Design Program, and she's going to speak just a second about the work of the students in this process. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Those of you who've been here for the past week know that the students have been working side by side and really benefiting from this. We're really super excited at the end of our first year of the Resilient Urban Design Program here in Charleston that we could capstone it with an activity like Dutch Dialogues. And we hope to see many of you as our future partners as we wrestle with how we're going to live with water in our future. Having said that, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Ray and BD. I do want to give a special thanks to Clemson and the Clemson Design Center. We couldn't have asked for a more ideal space to host this workshop. I mean, this building and your facility has really just worked ideally, and so thank you so much for allowing us to sort of take it over, which we really have done with our teams here over the past 4 days. So thank you. I'm Winslow Hasty. I'm the president and CEO of the Historic Charleston Foundation, and we are very proud and honored to be spearheading this effort with lots of community partners. We've got a little logo farm up here, but I do want to point out some of our key sponsors and partners that have been involved in this project from the beginning. The American Flood Coalition, a nonprofit advocacy organization based in DC, is a key sponsor. We have the Charleston Water System, the Medical University of South Carolina, Nature Conservancy, and then of course we've got the core team, which represented by the Water Institute of the Gulf, Wagner and Ball Architects out of New Orleans, as well as the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We really couldn't have done this without the help of the Dutch Embassy, and that, interestingly, that's sort of where this whole germ of an idea kind of was started. So we are just thrilled to have such a broad-based network of community partners. What we are finding is that is a critical aspect of this project, is making sure that we've got the right voices at the table. What the Dutch Dialogues, what I've learned now, having done the colloquium in May and now this really intensive workshop this entire week, is it's bringing outside expertise from around the country and certainly from the Netherlands. But it's really the key where, as Dale likes to call it, where the sort of magic happens is when you get the local community, the local experts, but also the local residents and community members who are experiencing the flooding on a daily basis and really understand how water operates and how it affects their daily lives. You layer that on top with the expertise of our local engineers and design community, landscape architects, and then of course bring that together with the just incredible team that Dale and David and their group brought to us. We really have a stellar team. These are some of the top minds, literally, in the world, understanding water management, urban design, and how all this sort of pieces fit together. So I do want to emphasize too that this is a work in progress, and I'm very excited to see this presentation as much as you, and but we still have some work to do. There will be a public unveiling of the final report later in September, on September 26th. So we'll keep you posted on that, but there'll be a big event at the Gilliard where we will sort of unveil the final report. So you're just getting a a sneak peek and getting hopefully a better understanding of how the process works and how it has worked over this last week. So with that, I will turn it over to Dale. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope some of you got some sleep, but some of us didn't. So this morning's presentation, this effort here, is really based on a lot of things. And one of that is the relationship that we have with the city of Charleston, the mayor, and the staff. Too many to name, but you know who you are. You've been very helpful and welcoming to us. I want to thank the mayor for making that possible. And I also want to thank, in particular, Councilman Seekings and Councilman Jackson. They were here with us all along, or as much as they possibly could be the last 4 or 5 days.
I'm representing Councilman Jackson because she could not get there.
Yeah, we understand. She is here in spirit, and she was here actively participating, and we thank them for that. This was a large and collective effort, and I want to thank people, and I want to recognize people to stand up, because I want to make a point with this. Will the Water Institute staff stand up? And the Wagner and Ball staff stand up, and a couple have left. Hey, Jan, will you stand up from the embassy? Can I have the Moffitt and Nickel folks stand up? Can I have the Arcadis and the Kimby Horn folks stand up? Any of the citizens and stakeholders who participated with us in the colloquium, citizen stakeholders, not local experts. You were doing that in Church Creek with us or at the open house and engaging. Could you stand up? Yep, you see what I'm doing here, right? Clemson University, College of Charleston, please stand up. The local design experts, landscape architects, engineers, subject matter experts, the financial folks from the medical district, please stand up. Good. And Beatty and Ray and the students, they're probably, they're right there. It's a collective effort. Our team engaging with you. And I thank you for this. I think you're going to own this. This is your work too. And it's done for the people who are not standing up and everyone else in Charleston. So thank you, and this is a collective effort. So what I want to do now is really put some caveats on here, because this is a 5-day effort and a year-long effort, but you know, this is not an engineering study, and this is not a comprehensive long-term plan. This is a lot of things that this is not. So what I want to give you now is our effort here. It's been a framing and a vision where we assert that water is primary and flood risk reduction is essential. And building off of the structure and the culture and the identity of Charleston is just the most important thing we could do. Some of us are outsiders and some of us are not, but that's what this effort was about. We're trying to knit these things together. It really is an optimistic story, I think. It's not a story of abandonment, and it's not a story of retreat, but it's a story of wise land use, occupation, and planning with investment that follows. If you don't do that investment and you don't make those plans, then maybe it is not an optimistic story. But this is an optimistic story, I think. And I want to say this because some of these images in here may, in our own little worlds, bother us. And we don't mean to do that. We are neither pro-growth nor anti-growth. That is your charge and your decision at the local base. We are doing what we think we had to do, and we're not advocating pro or anti-growth. We are not anti-development nor pro-development. That is your choice here in Charleston. We are trying to show you that whatever you do, this is what we think you should do given your water challenges. You have other challenges that you need to knit into that, but this is crucial. We're not trying to validate anyone. We also think we have a bias, and our bias really is to work with the natural and ecological systems that are here. If you ignore them, Mother Nature eventually will win. So respect that and make human safety your primary focus. the natural and the human, and make those work. And I'm gonna, another caveat. You're going to see some images. We're from the outside. There are landowners in here, or landowners who will see this. If we have touched upon a parcel of your land and it is not as elegant as it should be, we apologize for that. We are not advocating or non-advocating anything. It's just our vision of where we think you should be going. So if we've touched your land, we don't mean to do that. But there are some things we think of some land spots in here where you should not be doing things, or you should change how you're doing them. So keep that in mind. Our mandate through this process, someone said, be no harm and do no harm. Well, you're already in a bunch of risk. But we were here not to do any harm. This came from the historian Joseph, right, who was here with us on Tuesday from the East Side community. Be no harm and do no harm. The city asks us, give us your carefully weighted advice. Don't validate us. So we didn't. But maybe there are some things that are lining up, and that shows the wisdom of your leaders. And maybe it'll show some things you need to change. And Jacob this is a design effort. Jacob, the planning director, told us to design the right thing. So we took that to heart. It may make some of you nervous, but we think it's the right thing to think about. Again, these are our carefully weighed impressions from people who have lived with water for a long time. The Dutch, the folks in Louisiana, our experiences in all the other sorts of places in the U.S. And now I'm going to pretty much talk about a few things, but this presentation you're having in front of you now, it's unrehearsed. It is raw. It is not polished. We finished last night at 4 a.m. There's a lot of work that's been going on. Some of us got to leave at 12:30. But this is after, 12, 14, 15-hour days over the last thing. So this is unpolished, and I just want you to understand that. We may have not had all of the words exactly right, okay, but you'll get our direction. And also, the final thing is, we are pleased with what we've done here. I couldn't say that last night because I didn't see the final thing. David and I are the only two people, the entire team, who really knew what all the teams were doing. And that's caused heartburn in our team, and they're never going to participate with us again. That's because we were trying to, on behalf of the city, engage with as many people we can, from the east side to Church Creek, etc. So this is unrehearsed, and we apologize for the blemishes, but the trend is going to, I think, it's the right thing. And here's another trend I'm going to talk about. Why were we invited in here? You know this trend. You have some water problems. There's the event. And you know what? Last night at 10:30, you had another event, and it was 1.5 or 1 inches of rain, and it wasn't a whole lot of rain, but it flooded, and the fire marshal came over and grabbed a few of the Dutch folks. Do you want to go see the flooding? And the Dutch were like, yes, let's go see the flooding. Storm chasers, right? So you have this event. And I want you to just look at this peak here. I showed this, the slide on the right, the image on the right, I showed this in May in the Copium. But look at the different colors at the top, and they're changing. These are moderate and major events. This trend is not going to change. So you need to do something different. Our colloquial report is online. Some of you participated. You can look at it. It's on that website. It is there. And it's a starting point for this. We've been out in the community engaging with a lot of folks, right? This was it from May. This is in the east side. But also, out in Crosstown Church in West Ashley, we've been to the Angel Oak, and we've been down River Road, and we've been in the new developments on Angel Oak, and we've under the culverts in Church Creek. We've walked this neighborhood right behind here. David and the team walked it the other night at 8:30, so we can understand what was going on. We've been out there. And now our presentation. To remind you, we were asked to focus on 4 areas, carefully selected typologies, and these are those. Church Creek and West Ashley, the Peninsula, really with looking at the medical district and the Lockwood Corridor, and New Market Creek and Bardell's Creek, which is sort of the east side, anchored in the Grace Bridge redevelopment zone, and out on John's Island. These are the areas we focused on, but you're going to see some things in here that are replicable and applicable elsewhere. And now I want to invite my friend and colleague and someone who's been with us, Pete Derrick, to come up and talk about this first sort of zoom out position. Pete, please. Oh, and I want to say one more thing. Sorry, Pete. When we went out to the church the other night, Pastor gave a few of us this. This is a water bottle, right? Okay, great. It's a water bottle. It's going to sustain us, right? Water. But it says on here, loving Charleston, living with water. Where's the pastor? Here's the pastor. Thank you for this, and this is what we are trying to do for you and with you. Loving Charleston so you can live with water.
Thanks, Bill. So we start at the regional level, and why do we do that? Because Dutch dialogues means that you look at all scales, at local scales, at city scale, but also at the regional scale. And that is because you want to understand the water system very well. Living with water means know where the water goes. And the Dutch know very well, we learned that in our history, that the water wants to go wherever it can go, and we can't stop it by administrative boundaries. So that's why we start looking at the coastal level, see what in addition to local measures we could do, and maybe ask ourselves whether or not Norfolk would need some kind of a regional coastal protection. This plan would in particular be valuable for one special risk, and that is the risk of hurricane surges. It's not the most frequent risk, as we saw last night. Rain can hit you any day. Hurricane only comes now and then, but if it comes, it's a big risk, and we all know that. And we all know that cities that were hit by hurricanes before, like Houston, Galveston, or New Orleans and the Mississippi Delta, are currently also developing these kind of coastal plans. Also the Netherlands has its plan. We call it the Delta Plan. The question is if it would be suitable and feasible also here to do it. We looked at one specific strategy. There's many ways to look at your regional scale. We looked at one specific strategy, and that is the multiple lines of defense strategy, which is a good strategy to protect against hurricanes. And in addition to those multiple lines of defense, we also looked, of course, at ways how to preserve and conserve that coastline from an ecosystems perspective, but also from a hurricane resiliency perspective. We started the first line. That first line of defense would be offshore in the water, where the forces of sand, wind, and water play out there. We could build barrier islands, as they are common along the east coast. Strong barriers, well protected. They reduce the force of the hurricane. We could also decide, instead of reducing that force, to go with those forces, use those forces of nature in a concept that we call building with nature, and build so-called sand engines, as you see in that picture up there. And a sand engine is deliberately developed and positioned in such a way that with the forces of wind and water, the sand is distributed in a very natural way along the coastline. And we would do that in particular, of course, in the more southern part, south of the jetties, because we've learned that there has been a lot of erosion, while up north of it, we all know there's a lot of sedimentation, the beach is even growing, so it wouldn't make sense to have those barrier islands over there. And building with nature can mean much more. This is just one example. You could also think in terms of mangroves restoration, coral reefs, oyster banks, seagrass. I know there are even some experiments ongoing here in this region with that. Many different ways to strengthen your coastline and strengthen your ecosystem with these building with nature measures. Should we do that? I would almost say it's a no-brainer. You can always do it. It's always good. Then right behind the dunes and the beaches that we strengthen with our building with nature, we find this big zone of low-lying, very low-lying area where basically you can say is a balance between land and water. From a natural point of view, you find here lots of wetlands and marshlands, of course, as the natural ecosystem, but there are also communities out here. There's many people living here. There's infrastructure out here, and it's a bit hard to distinguish. I think the colors are fading.
I now see some are in green and others are in yellow, but it disappears in the projector. So just learn from me, and you will see it later in the handouts or on internet when we show it, that some of them are in yellow, and that are the communities that we could make more resilient with measures like the picture shows here, but also by making critical infrastructure more resilient. So there is a way to live here, and at the same time also strengthen wetlands that are the other ones in green, but green and yellow here disappear. So you have to look at that in a different way. Basically a zone where you are still in front of what would be kind of a protection line of defense. That's the most interesting one, that's why I call it that one in red. This is the one zone that should protect everything that is right behind it, and that means it has to be seamless. And this red line could be civil engineered or more nature-based. This image gives, I think, a nice impression of what it could look like. A bit of both. There's a lot of space here. I wouldn't build flood walls or anything like that. It could be like a natural berm in the landscape, but it has to be solid and it has to be seamless. And seamless means that in this line you will also need a couple of barriers, storm surge barriers, movable gates in those big circles they are drawn. They're pretty big. The biggest one in the middle would be 2 miles. At the bottom, the one would be 2,000 feet. If you would build those, you would immediately be in the super league of storm surge barrier owners in the world, because they would be exceptionally big. They would even be bigger than the biggest currently on Earth. So, doesn't sound like a very probable scenario for you. This would be multi-billion-dollar structures. And would really catapult you into a complete other area. I think immediately we all feel by intuition that that third red line is probably not the line you would like to defend. Also because it doesn't solve most of your problems here, because the local problems here related to intensified rainfall and tidal impacts are not solved by any of these barriers, because they only protect temporarily against the risk of a hurricane storm surge. Something that New Orleans desperately needed, for instance, but New Orleans is largely below, is for a large part below sea level. It's a completely different story from here. There's also a more confined area that is protected. You would have to protect here a giant area at a very high price. I didn't do any calculation here, but so on average, these kind of master plans cost around $30 billion or something. In other areas, I would say you're not going to do that. It feels like a no-brainer. At the same time, those first two lines that I described, with these nature-based conservation type of solutions, adding value to your communities there, improving the ecosystem, and at the same time also help to reduce the forces of a hurricane, seem to be, for me, a no-brainer, and I would consider that a no regret.
So, good morning, I'm David Wagner. So I'm going to play this moderator role, basically, and let me get the context that you're living in a vast coastal plain. Well, it's much smaller. It's still expensive for us in Charleston, Montana. But where are you situated? We go first now to Andy Sternad and Nisha Fetters, who are going to talk about the furthest out area we study, which is Johns Island.
So everybody hold on to your seats. We're going to speed up a little bit and approach the rate of film here. So Johns Island, to contextualize, is a sea island buffered by the barrier islands, protecting the mainland. It's a primary role in the landscape going forward. Just to emphasize something Pete concluded with, the low country landscape here is naturally resilient, and it's naturally designed to regenerate and protect itself in layers. Johns Island, as a sea island, is part of one of those layers protecting against surge towards the mainland. Pete also mentioned the dunes. The dunes are a critical function of the barrier islands, naturally meant to move. You see all these yellow stripes across the islands were former coastal barrier islands, former dune ridges that have moved over time. That process is still underway and going on. but those hard structural sand ridges are still present throughout Johns Island, throughout the Sea Island landscape. We can take advantage of that in a couple of ways. These ridges essentially make up the Maybank corridor, dunes like this, compacted deep underground. The Johns Island itself has, it's a sea island, it's part of this type, but it also has its own particular identity. It's got these sand ridges parallel to the coast. It's got an incredible forest canopy, incredible natural ecological system, something for which the Low Country is famous for. It's also got particular characteristics of soil and ground, which are naturally taken advantage of by historic inhabitants of the island, the historic landscape and ecosystems, and can be utilized more going forward. This is a famous salt marsh known worldwide. It's also a keystone ecological place in the whole Low Country, specifically Johns Island. Keystone for water, for species, for fish growth. Nature on Johns Island is deeply rooted. Angelo. Culture and people are also deeply rooted there. The Gullah Geechee community, historic agriculture, historic homes, and newer communities. These are things that we have to acknowledge there and include in all of your thinking. The stormwater risk from rainfall is something we acknowledged last night. It's something that's more routinely acknowledged, including on Johns Island. The kind of ponding and pooling that happens, consequences of new development for shedding rainwater. It's something that we experience here almost on a weekly basis. There are lots of stormwater codes, lots of guidelines for situations like this, impacted by the tide level. So regulations of dry pipes versus wet pipes, we can get into that more detail about that later. But the tide level fundamentally impacts the drainage system. So any regulation you make relative to that tide level might have unintended consequences for the land. You might, where we've seen that fill has been used to meet the requirement versus other kinds of natural solutions. But we try to anticipate all of these things going forward. The underlying risk on Johns Island is the storm surge. It's a sea island, it's near the coast, and that should drive, in our opinion, development of the future on this island. You can't put people in risky zones. So you see the return period across the bottom. That means how often you could expect to see a storm. Some historic storms along the line, including November 2018, which is the king tide. So these were surge levels reached in those events, tide levels reached. And these levels are fundamentally guiding our thinking in Johns Island. Johns Island shouldn't be thought about in plan from overhead. It should be thought about in terms of levels and section and cross-section. There's a wet zone from 0 to 6 feet, approximately, which is the 10-year return period. That means it gets wet frequently. Nothing should be built there. There's a zone from 6 to 10 feet we're calling the ecological zone. This is crucial function for salt marsh, just upland. It's receiving water coming down watersheds. There should be very limited construction, no tract development. We'll get into a little bit more detail about recommendations. This ecological zone can expect to be wet currently in a 100-year storm. That means 0.1% chance of getting wet every year. In the future, with sea level rise, the curves change. And that 100-year storm on the curve today, with 2-foot rise sea level rise becomes a 50-year storm. That means 2% chance happening every year. With a 3-foot sea level rise, it becomes a 25-year storm. It means a 4% chance happening every year. 25. My math is bad, but it's happening more often. How that affects now is how you plan for critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure, things like evacuation routes, fire stations, should be planned for those future levels and future events. Even if regulations for broader development are staged over time to meet that level. So these 4 zones, the wet, ecological, the transitional zone from 10 to 15 feet, and then the community zone above 15 feet are fundamentally based on water levels around safety. It's a safety first plan for Johns Island. I'm echoing a lot of things that have been proposed before. There are good ideas out there about this. we're reinforcing some of them. Cross-section through the island. You'll notice that the community zone is plus 15 feet is on the historic sand ridges. It's stronger ground. It's also smaller ground. So we need to use it wisely. We need to use its sand characteristic to infiltrate rainwater. That doesn't mean you don't develop in the 10 to 15 foot range, but you develop differently to take advantage of those qualities of landscape, the rain coming down, also the water coming up. So across the landscape, this is from the Stone River on the left down to the ocean. You see those historic barrier island dune structures. The first big one is the Maybank Ridge, then there's Upper Burden Creek. There's another one, the Plowground region, Plowground Road region. But the strength of the island is on the ridges. That's the place that can support, both in terms of infiltration and structurally, a denser kind of development. It's the safest ground. That's where people should be concentrated if future development is to happen on Giant Island in our opinion. Over time, some of the lower developments might have a managed retreat strategy 50 plus years, fundamentally moving people out of the risky zone. Within each of we have developed a series of recommendations within each of these zones, and I'll hand it over to each and walk you through those.
Yeah, after the analysis of the landscape and of our assignment, we would go on with you for some spatial proposals we developed last days. As we think that developing based on the identity of the landscape, it is very much developing on the different conditions of those zones. And we started with providing some developers guidelines. You see them summarized in this scheme. And the important thing is that our proposal is not to build any more in the wetland zone, under the 6 feet zone. Very limited development, just a very specific way can be possible in the ecological zone. Then you have the transitional zone above the 10 feet line and the community zone, and we provided some development is possible. But every zone requires a different approach, we think. To point it out a little bit, this is the wetland zone, and in our opinion, the marsh is very important also to protect the island against the flooding and the storm surge. So we want to protect it and develop living shorelines along the borders, and also make it possible for the people who live on the island to have better access to the river, to the water system. And we want to be very careful with the marshlands and keep from the 5th feet line on oak trees can grow, and we want to be very careful with them also. In the ecological zone, as you saw on the scheme, some single houses can be possible, but only on stilts, without any landfill. Keep the forests, and also the roads has to be built on bridges, and the road has to be on 8 feet high because of the safety. In this zone, the blue water, it is maybe a swale or a former creek, and we want to develop them, and I come back to that later because they're very important for the discharge of the water from the higher zones. Then in the transitional zone, they can be built on stilts, but also on very small clustered landfills, only under the roads, under the houses. We want to keep an average coverage of the forest in that zone, because the trees are also very important for the drainage of the water. No landfill, not removing the soil. There are some rules we want to give for development in this zone. And then on the higher grounds, on the sand ridges, it is possible to build over there. The water storage, it's more an infiltration in the soil, we think, so we can keep the rainwater there. We want clustering houses, but also in this part for us it is very important that we can keep the image of living under and between the trees in this zone. So I think we have to be real rules for the coverage of the roads and the houses in the zone. When we look at more specific to the possibilities of the soil, you can see that in the higher zones, the community zone and the transitional zone, there is a good storage of water infiltration in the soil, and in the wetlands it is now hardly nothing, so it's also an argument not to build and to live there. But we think it's not enough that it's only good soil. We think that we have to take some measures to add to really to be sure that the water, for the discharge of the water, and also for ecological conditions. Because there is already, of course, a system of channels and recharge areas, but we want to restore the more natural flows of the swales and the creeks, and we want to be, as you could see in the development requirements, we want in every development have some rules about the water, because Andy showed some images about the underground pipe system, and we would like to stop with that and pull up the water again to the surface of the soil and to the landscape. So every development has to have some bioswales, for instance, or some ponds, or infiltration water. And we think we have to restore a kind of natural patterns of the former creek system and connect the new neighborhoods with that. As we are talking about not building in the wetland zones and very few building possible in the ecological zone, of course, we're talking about someone's property. Some developers may have some ground already in that zones. But we think it only can be realized when we take advantage and use of already existing possibilities to trade the rights between owners. For example, when you have some of your property is for 50% in a lower zone, below the 10 feet line, maybe you can, within one watershed, you can trade your rights with a developer who is on the centuries, or when your whole property is in a wetland zone, maybe you can trade development rights. And also there's something about the requirements for open space that can be traded between owners. We think that is essential, of course, for the idea we have over the living and development in the different zones. Also, we have to consider that not everything has to be realized immediately. Of course, it's very important now immediately to start with conservation of the existing ecological assets. In the coming years, we can imagine that there is a kind of an integrated watershed master plan can be made, and also it's kind of evaluation of the existing zoning plan. And then after years after, of course, some improvement can be made. And after the goal in the long term is to have a resilient development. I will show you some images about what we think such a kind of integrated master plan for the watershed can be. The zones above are the sand ridges, and as we thought, we think it can be developed in a very different way from the ecological zone below the 10 feet line. But I think we need a kind of green-blue framework in the transition zone to be sure that the water from the higher zones can reach the creek zone for the discharge of the water, and also for the storage of the water that you want. So this is a kind of our concept, and we made a sketch that just show what it can be. And in our vision, the new zones, I think the colors are not very well, so I can point it out. The more dark green zones are new, and we looked very carefully to the elevation zones in the landscape and the existing historical Greek pattern. And we think you can make those zones, and they have a lot of advantages, of course, functional advantages about the discharge of the water and the storage of the water, but also there are kind of ecological zones. We can make a connection between the salt marshlands and freshwater swamps above. We can make a connection in the wood system, and we think it also can be a kind of connection for the people who live there. We can imagine that there is a public accessibility, we have bike paths through it, and so the people who are living in a more high density area along the Maybank Highway, they immediately can go to the nature, and because everyone told us that's really the identity of living on the island. A short evaluation of the urban growth boundary. When we put it on our sketch map, then you can see that the most area inside the urban growth boundary is on the Maybank. St. Regis, and it's good from the point of view of the landscape. It is a good position. But we see that when it is extension to the south, it goes more into the low zone of the wetlands and the ecological zone. So we can imagine that looking at some extension to the north can be more profitable. Yeah, and then at the end, this is our vision on the island life, and we think it can be beautiful when all the people there can really feel embraced by nature, by the new zones, and they can really feel that they live in the nature. So I thank you, and I will thank the whole team. We worked on it on this vision.
Johns Island team, you notice similarities between the Johns Island community plan perhaps, but different kind of emphasis, different perspective, different scale of response. Robert Coney is going to come up and speak about Church Creek. And Johns Island is sort of an advice about what we do with an asset that is more or less still to be determined. Church Creek's a bit different.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all my group members who did a tremendous work last 4 days. They worked for 8 days in these 4 days, so it was very fine that they did that work. West Ashley area, it's more up, more upstream. It's also more with fluvial aspects in it. Church Creek is part of that, and well, perhaps you think I'm mistaken because this is not Church Creek, of course, but it's about identity. The Angelo, the part of identity of Charleston itself. It gives oxygen, it gives power to the landscape, and if you look very carefully, in fact, you see the Charleston rivers and the creeks into the system of the and together they look like the Angelo. They're big and small branches and they have leaves. But what happens? The occupying the landscape branches and leaves have been cut off. And our goal is to restore that part. And to find a new balance, to create a healthy, safe, and prosperous city and landscape. Let me show you some of those features of the landscape. And well, in fact, there are a lot of so much beautiful things that you would like to embrace. The tidal landscape of the Church Creek, by example. At some places, it's more tightened up, it's refitted, and also, well, things recent. Things are going on by the voluntary buyout of houses which are in too low laying areas, those floodplains. New houses have been built, and in fact they are already being built and adapted, but also not connected with the landscape, and that's what we would like to see. Make it adaptive, but also connected to those landscape features. Well, one of the main landscape features, a bit more more stream up are those phosphate mines. It's a part of the cultural identity of Charleston too. So we have a development of landscape with big wetlands, which getting smaller and smaller, and the city is occupying that. And we have a water assignment. These two are coming together, and the red dots on this sheet show that a lot of housing have been built already in those floodplains, which will be involved by sea level rise in the tidal part and rain flooding in the more upper part. And this is the 1 acre high amount of surface you need to adapt on one way or another way, and that's what we would like that's what we noticed. So we have two things that we would like to say as a kind of statement. We noticed it's a part of that rain flooding system, which is very important. And so, in fact, we don't have to solve a safety issue here. That's more in John Island part. Here it's about the flooding issue, and it makes confidence and damage, so we have to deal with that. And we think water is not a problem. So perhaps that's new for you, but it's the planning, the way of planning and making the urbanization in balance with the water. That will be the main thing to solve. So there we focused on in the Church Creek area. So we say we have a kind of multiple approach. In ecological-based planning, which Bill in the introduction talked already about integrated water strategy, and we want to embrace and develop the cultural landscape. So about it, that dealing with the natural landscape, that's about force, that's about power. Don't fight against nature, you won't win it. So stop boxing, but embrace the natural force, make it your force, and deal with it on a more natural way, with cultural, of course, elements in it. Use of force to strengthen the landscape itself. By example, when the sea level will rise, more deposit from the tidal movement will come into tidal zones and will also heighten those tidal zones. Don't fight with it, don't put pumps to stop that, but just let it go with time enough. But you need to act in some way with it. The second one is to have a way of thinking of integrated water system. And it means that there's some places in the higher, the leaf parts of the tree, you try to retain the water. The lower part is you try to store that water, and when the water inconvenience is gone, you can let it go. And at some point, when you have no retain or store possibilities, you have to just discharge the water. And that's important. It used to be like this, in one big sponge, which is the wetland, with the creek system around. And now we have tidal floodplains, which are more in danger. But we also have two rivers, the Ashley River on the north and the Stonewall River on the south. And in the other direction, we have the county part in the north and more urban area down. So it's a shared system now. All kind of things are there, but they are not very well connected. They are too small. So what we would like to see is that retain, store, discharge system is being connected and being evolved by enlarging the floodplains. And the discharge system, we make it as flexible as possible. Then when at a certain time it could flow to the Ashley River, and at another time it could flow to the Stonewall River. Not everywhere, because we have the watershed, but you can steer the water also. Well, this is in fact the enlargement of the present green-blue system with very narrow lines in that, and this is what we would like to achieve. We make them wider, by making new edges, wider floodplains, and make it flexible. So here it's going to discharge to the Ashley, and in this way it's going to discharge to the Stono River. And all the green areas are enlarged floodplains. There are housing in, so the housing we have to adapt, and I think we can really do that on different ways. Ije also made that possible, I'll come later to that. The third one is to develop that cultural landscape. Like, by example, in Mexico, the tequila, which is a mountain, also make it a farmland from the agave plant, and from the agave plant we take tequila, we make tequila, but also sisal fiber. So combine that and make it also an economical profit. And here something else also has happened. It's the phosphite mining. It has that scars in the landscape, but they are also attractive. But it also has a non-visible aspect, and that's the story behind it with the slavery. Just explore that in terms of make it visible, tell the story. So that will be inspiring things for the future. And then I come to the proposal. This is in fact a drawing of the green-blue network. Sorry about the lines in it. The scanner couldn't handle our drawing, or we make our drawing a bit too colorful. Though you see the same structure, you see the red areas, which are new adaptive developments within the floodplain. It's not going to happen next year or the year beyond it. We have, let's say, 20, 30, 50 years to do so, but we have to react on that in this moment. So let me point out, and I don't know how this exactly works. It's here to suction zone in the north side of the Church Creek. There, because of the sea level rise, there's an extended floodplain. We would like to build there new houses, but we also want to make a new mark in it. There's also a new cultural aspect. We want to make a new parkway along the tidal area, which has made it more accessible also by biking and by walking. And we want to build there on an adaptive way with new housing. Whether this is the new Charleston style or not, that's not my choice. That's over to the architect. But you can think wide, and we were asked to think out of the box. So let's get out of this box. But this is a Charleston item. This is the Hampton Park in Charleston. It was made by Olmsted, and Olmsted, well, of course, a lot of you know Olmsted as the master of making parkways in Central Park, in Boston, and he also made it here. So making the edge as a parkway through whole of West Ashley and Church Creek would be so beautiful. Crossing infrastructure is of course also an item. We have to take care that the roads and also excavation roads should be optimized and should be there. It's not only about nature and occupation, but the roads are quite important. We can do that with culverts under existing roads. We can hire them. We can make that. So that's also not a problem. And here, yes, without stripes, it's not possible. It was too late last night. But here, by example, for Long Savannah, we made a kind of conceptual drawing with long lines of water which can discharge in two ways. When there's too much water on the Ashley side, it will discharge to Stono, and the other way around. And it's about retaining and restoring water on the side itself too. That's the main issue, and there you have to make appointments with the developer about that. The cultural landscape on the north side, with all those phosphate mining, with the old tracks of the railways, which will become new paths, which are connected with the parkway, which is along the floodplains. We make a whole new network, where you can explore the landscape from. We also made a start of a toolbox to show how the floodplain improvement, the pond retrofits, the canal improvement, permeable pavement, bioswale could add to the task of the water assignment, and we can make it quite a good way. So I will finish with let's say we have a lot of recommendations, but 3 are quite important. First of all, I don't know if you know anything about horse racing, but that's the kind of strategy that we would like to add to. Because we would choose to use the carrot and not the stick in this kind of recommendation. So the local jurisdiction level should be incentivized. With tax incentives, we would like to possible to transfer development rights, create positive press, and be expedited permit review at the city. What has to be done? A regional zoning and planning body has to be arranged. And the city and county should adapt the same standards and prioritize the same infrastructure. Thank you very much.
So in this case, it's sort of a remedy, but the system may be shattered, but it's not beyond recall. It's going to be hard to engineer by increment a holistic place. But this is the back to the water is the asset, and the asset of the area is the peninsula. The cultural asset is the tree, the cultural asset is the people, the icon is the peninsula. Fritz Palmboom is going to come up and speak about the urban identity. I don't see Fritz, and Fritz is also going to come back after Peter Shingding in a minute.
Thank you, David. The Peninsula the most urbanized area of the whole region we are talking about, and where Pete started his explanation about. Some of the images that Ietje and Robert showed about the nature of Charleston were really very impressive for us. They were a kind of extra seduction to participate in those Dutch dialogues. But there is also another picture that's not so much about the nature as well as about the urban quality of Charleston, and well, maybe this is the image that was most seductive to participate, not only to try to help with our expertise to solve problems of the site, but also to use our expertise to raise the quality and the beauty of the site. This is a little sketch of the same place, High Battery, where the city embraces the sea with the building of the historical foundation. Oh, I can use the pointer. Yeah, we're folding around this little part of nature as a fragment of the beach, but also very important, the protection against the sea is not just a sea wall, but it's an urban amenity in itself. It's an urban space, it's a public space where you can mingle around, where you can meet each other, where you can enjoy the city as well as the sea. But it's not only that. There are 3 other things that I want to highlight regarding the identity of Charleston. It's also the houses and the gardens. This fantastic typology with the houses making a twist, with the verandas to the side facade, with this beautiful relation between the inside and the outside of the houses, but also with the transparency from the street, looking into the depth of the parcel where the view of the gardens and the trees are part of the urban scene. It makes the city breathe in a way. So transparency is a very fundamental value, I think, in the spatial quality of Charleston. In combination with the endless variation of this typology, you can find it in the richest parts of the city, but we will see later on, we can find it even in the poorest parts of the city. And then, secondly, there are the streets and the trees. The streets not being just a technical feature for transportation, but a place to be, a place to linger, shaded by the trees, creating shelter, but at the same time creating perspective in the depth, so you get a feeling not only for the place where you are, but also for the city as a whole. And those streets are part of a system of grid, and the grid offers views. And then the peninsula meets the grid, which makes it even more interesting. On the peninsula, you have leading streets offering perspectives to the water on all three sides, potentially at least, and historically there were open relationships. Nowadays many of them are blocked, but I think when we talk about the relation between the inside of the peninsula and the outside of the peninsula, we meet a lot of problems, but we also have the opportunity in a way to reconnect the street system with the water around. The culmination point, as I told, for me is high battery, here shown from the inside of the city, looking outwards with the park of low battery and the view on the other shoreline of Ashley River. And yeah, I didn't know the English word, zeegat. It's a Dutch word, the sea view, the little hollow where you can see the real sea that attracts you, and that gives a kind of very strong relation from the infinity of the city interior to the wide expanse of the sea itself. From there on, here again, you see high battery with the building of the historical foundation, the low battery with the park, Murray Boulevard, and then it develops in Rockwood with some curvatures in the lines, but also high pressure of traffic, the Citadel, and beyond that a more even natural landscape of Ashley River that is directly linked with the images that Robert and Ichi showed us. So it unfolds like a beautiful series of different spaces, kind of necklace starting from the very urbanized and cultural, artificial high battery onto the Ashley River landscape. This is the west side of the peninsula. This is the image that McGall drew of the western side, existing situation and future potentials are mixed up. You can try to decipher them, but the most important thing is that it from origin has more a harbor activities oriented character, so the peninsula as a whole has a very different characteristics that you can play with, that you can build upon in the future. This whole narrative is extremely challenged by the changes in the climate and water system. The stormwater of the Merit was also impressive to us. Peter will take over and will go in more to the technical, systematic aspects of the peninsula as a whole. Yeah? Yes, thank you, Fritz, for this introduction to the city and the urban qualities. And I
go further with this map. This map shows how the city is developing somewhere in the mid-19th century. And you can see that almost every street is very much related to the morphology, the natural morphology. It's the backbone from north to south, Green Street and Spring Street, already been there since a long period. And it's the streets that stretch out from the higher natural grounds backbone to the water on both sides. And you can also see that there are still some creek beds, and they go into the city very deep. And you can also see that the city is developing in a marsh, so it's all landfills. And if you project on the border nowadays, you can see that there's still the backbone and there's the landfills in a ring around it. We think that looking at this original morphology and considering that it's a backbone, and it's landfills, and then it's the rivers, and rethink the water system from this perspective, that would work. I think it would solve a lot of the problems that you're dealing with. Because there are many hazards, and you all know them. Yesterday we saw the stormwater flooding, but there's also high tides, and especially when they occur at the same time, that's a problem. There's the storm surges that come. And living in a flat land and in a densely occupied flat land that this city is, that's difficult. So you need to deal with it. You are going to experience water troubles more often when sea level rises and stormwater becomes more heavy. We think, and this is a strategy, that there are different ways to deal with higher water levels in the surrounding, high water levels in the sea, but the existing system with free flow by gravity maybe without groundwater control is not going to work. So there are two main things that you can do. On the horizontal axis you see actually timeline, and the timeline is the sea level rise. Now you can grow above to ratio land, ratio crucial functions. That's the one thing that you can do. But at the end, we think that groundwater will be very crucial and will be so high that you're going to experience that very wet conditions always actually. So in the end, you need to control the water levels better than you do now, we think. And we think that something like a full strategy below that could work, so lower and control groundwater combined maybe with some aspects of some highland structures. This is a section over the backbone from the left to the east. You can see the backbone that's pleistocene deposits, it's a solid material, and on the edges there have been marsh deposits, and on those marsh deposits the landfills took place. And that's also the reason that the landfills are also lowering. They are originally filled up higher, but the land is subsiding, and that's where you experience the flooding, the first protection. But you can also see there's an underground system with lots of tubes and pipes. There are different ones. These ones are very important. These are the stormwater drains. And they are around the same level as we have seen. You can see that they are very deep compared to the backbone and a little bit more shallow compared to the level of the and there's also here, what you're already investing in, the drop sheds with the planned pump stations to improve the drainage system. What you can also see is that now these drains can drain under gravity to the rivers, but only during low tides. And if tides get higher, this is now the present high tide level. High tide level will raise, and of course the period in which the system can drain under gravity will be too short. And there's another thing, that's a subsidence. So sea level is rising, and also the land is subsiding. The shallow areas are subsiding, and the shallow subsidence in the landfills is 5 meters, sometimes even 30 every year. And there's a sea level rise, and there's also exercise, and it all counts. So it's one and another together. So your level to the sea is lowering relatively. So we've been thinking about this system and how it could work in the future. If you think about a concept that you could call a folder, but an urban folder, so a system with a strong border, clear border, in which the water level is controlled, completely isolated from the outside. It starts with thinking of a flood wall, and the Army Corps of Engineers presentation is already thinking about it. The flood wall needs to be aligned on a logical place, and we can also see that there are some low parts maybe that you can embed inside the flood wall. That could be beneficial in the future if you need extra water storage. So that's the first layer or first element of this system. The second one is that you have low spots that are very vulnerable already for flooding, and especially when they are on crucial land use places. You could consider to, as a local measure, fill some streets maybe to get the dips out of the streets, and there are some spots where you could think about, for instance, medical district, maybe design a next level, next transportation level on top of the low area, for example. The third layer is the deep drainage system that's designed and also built part of it. We think it could work, it could improve your drainage structure very good, of course. And there's a shallow drainage system, and in this shallow drainage system you can experience the biggest problems, of course, because now it's improved already with some check valves that prevent flooding from the rivers into the urban area during high tides. And it's not completed yet, but it will work very good, but it's only temporary. In the end, it won't work anymore if sea level rises more. So what we think, what could work, is to introduce another way of thinking about this shallow drainage system. And it's more adapted to the difference between the higher backbone and the lower areas land coastal. We think about a separated system, 2 layers. 1 layer on the higher grounds, maybe with a ring structure, with outlets that completely bypass the low areas, and it can still work under gravity. Yeah? So you can get rid of your water, making use of the gravity. And there's a second ring inside the flood wall with surface water and also underground pipes that also has storage in there, and that is also can be used to control the groundwater levels in the future, because you're going to need it. And that's a system that works with pipes. That's a storage networks. 2 layers. You need to add storage also to it. That can be added to the drainage system. That makes it much more efficient. Different spots can be used: private plots, streets, some low areas. And in fact, you need all these layers to work together. And but you can also think about the city in subdivisions, and you can, for every subdivision, define the best package, the best mix of measures. So, and this is how it could work in the future. A new section, you put them together, and you see that the drainage pipes here are raised. We raise the ground level, water level here, so it can still work with gravity. There's the flood walls. The level of the flood wall is still in discussion. There's the low system with the pumps, and you can also see those low areas inside the flood wall can be used as water storage. And of course, there's water storage everywhere in the city, on the houses, under the streets, low areas, all excellent. And of course, it's a long-term vision, idea, direction. Every step that you take now can contribute to a system like this in the future. It can be adapted to needs, to possibilities. But it's always good to work towards a long-term structure. We think this is the direction that could work. Needs some research, of course. It's how we think about the city and the future. Thank you.
So I think we should take a breath. What he just showed you, if you understand what he just showed you. It's been said Charleston's a reactive city. This is a major renovation. You know, if you continue to make individual decisions and you're going to engineer your way out of that isolated problem, you may have wasted a lot of money. And the sums of money you're going to spend go up. Stephen Slaughters is going to come up now and talk about that first line of defense. Remember, Pete showed you the regional approach, which said you need the sand dunes and all that, and if you were to think about a barrier out there, you can't justify it under the BCA. The real asset value that the Corps or the government's going to consider is the peninsula. So once you protect this peninsula, the asset value available against the rest of it is disappearing. So, you know, the living with nature in the wetter areas and the more natural areas, West Ashley and elsewhere, becomes more and more evident. But the decisions you make about where you're going to put this line of defense should be influenced by what you just saw about the water storage that you need inside that barrier. So this is a complex set of decisions that need to be made. Stephen's going to talk to you about some alternatives you might have about the first line of defense, given that the first line is really not going to be that line constructed in the marsh.
Thanks, David. But first, look at that bathing house at the very south point of the peninsula. That's about living with the water. As a landscape architect, I fully understand the joy of living on the peninsula, because here you always experience the water. There's always a glimpse of the glittering water at the end of the road. You can feel the water, you can almost touch it. So Charleston has a great historic atmosphere with those beautiful houses, the gorgeous gardens, the historic streets. The historic atmosphere is not only in these built structures and elements, it's also in its relationship with the water. So water for the peninsula is a core quality, but at the same time the water threatens historic Charleston. Sea level rise, heavy rains like yesterday evening, rising groundwater, storm surge, passing hurricanes, they all threaten, each in its own way, Charleston. As explained by Peter, we propose to develop the peninsula as a polar, and therefore we have to strengthen the protection against the outside water. There's no alternative for that. If you want to improve flood safety at the peninsula, you have to raise your seawalls, no doubt about that. But how much you have to hide in them depends on how safe you want to be and how much money you can spend. For this moment, 9 feet high for the whole ring seems quite reasonable. And 9 feet high is the height of High Battery at the moment. With that height, for the whole ring, we would have dealt with all the historic floods, including Yukon 1989. But what's good for today doesn't have to be good for tomorrow. Sea level is still on the rise and storm frequency is increasing. So for the next generation, 10, 11, maybe 12 feet might be more appropriate. By the way, I don't like the term seawall. A wall usually is built to keep things or people out. We want to develop a first defense line that keeps the water out, but at the same time strengthens that unique relationship of the peninsula with the surrounding water. It's not about a seawall, but about a connecting zone, a connecting and protecting zone. So that first defense line has to be as short as possible, as less complicated as possible, and as less regrettable on the long term as imaginable. So, short, less complicated, and less regrettable. And we investigated the development of a strong ring levee based on the protection that already is here. We make use of existing seawalls or levees, but they have to be strengthened, and additions are needed to realize a coherent system. Where can we follow existing lines or structures, and where and when does it make sense to investigate the possibilities to develop a more autonomous line? These are the main two questions. And remember, Charleston is the fastest growing coastal town between New York and Miami. Amazing. But that makes it is wise to think about room for expansion for next generations. And that brings me to the issue of the position of the first defense line in relation to the port area over there. And I'm going from the north to the south and then back to the west side. So once again, that brings me to the issue of the position of the first defense line in relation to the port area. Charleston has 4 port areas. And I wonder if this area in the heart of the city has on the longer term enough room for economic growth. All over the world, we see that port areas situated in the heart of the city gets relocated to supply them more room for expansion and to release the city of the nuisance due to those port areas. From the perspective of a vital port development, as well from the perspective of a healthy city prepared to sea level rise and to the expected growth, Charleston could consider a position of the levee that on the longer term supplies room for the city. For the port area, we recommend further investigation to the possibility of a levee more east of East Bay Street. That's an important recommendation. Further to the south, we can follow Waterfront Park, where there's enough room to raise the event zone, and by then we are at high battery that already is at 9 feet. Low battery has to be elevated, but believe me, the designs I saw for this reinforcement really look good. So you can do it. But the west side story is an entirely different story. Maria. For the west coast of the peninsula, we investigated 2 different strategies. First, a strategy in which the levee follows the edge of the peninsula as tight as possible. But the alternative strategy in which the levee is developed as a more autonomous line. And the strategy of the autonomous line opens completely new opportunities. And you can see it over here. So in this proposal, we didn't follow the existing edge of the peninsula, but a more autonomous line. New opportunities because it enriches Charleston with a unique scenic river experience. The track at the top of the levee offers Charleston's most picturesque sunset. It supplies the peninsula much more room for water storage. As explained, the importance of that just by Peter. That's a great advantage. Last night, once again proved the importance of an increased water storage to deal with your heavy rains. And in a practical way, it stays away from the existing properties. That makes it a lot easier to get realized. But there's always a but. Although storm surges are integrated, this line will have a big impact on the ecological quality of the marshlands behind the levee. And it will be hard, if not impossible, to incorporate the existing recreation harbor. Therefore, later this morning, Fritz will shortly present the opportunities of the tight position that offers other advantages, but also different disadvantages. Thank you so much.
So there's a lot to investigate, and you can understand that the Dutch can't come here and tell you the answer to these long-term questions. The scales that the Dutch always insist on thinking about across time. But you're going to make some of these investments sooner than others. And that line right there may be made sooner depending on when you get money and the next storm comes. But those considerations about the port and others are sensitive. But they need to be made in time. And you're forced into making decisions sooner because of that as you think through it. So those all have cultural and economic considerations and ecological considerations. We were asked to study not the peninsula. We were asked to study all that, right? It's just the basis of the thought. We were asked to study the Lockwood Carter Medical District. And Fritz, you're going to come back and talk about that, where you are, sir, out there again, Fritz. I doubt you're tall, but you're sitting down there my size. Fritz, come back and from the urban character of Lockwood Carter Medical District.
So we are going more in detail, more focusing on this special site, and in this case the site is really very special because Medical District, of course, is an absolutely crucial amenity of the city, and if with a storm model like yesterday evening, it immediately has very difficult circumstances that should be solved as soon as possible. Medical District is a cluster of different hospitals and universities.
No speakable
that
content can be
really
found on the screen. No
that
speakable
are
content can be found on the
already
screen.
closely collaborating to solve that, and again, not only with the perspective to solve the most urgent problems, but also to raise the quality of the medical amenities in itself, placing the patient in the central position. For us, it was the challenge to understand the plans that the Central Medical District already has, to look if you can build upon the shoulders of those plans, if you can add more perspective on the long term, but also to combine the goals of the medicine world with the urban world, taking into account that where the medicine world talks about patients, the urbanists talk about citizens, and that, as a matter of fact, they are the same or they can be the same. Here a very short summary of the goals of the master plan of the medical center, with goal 4 or objective 3, to provide the patient with an exceptional experience, including the experience of the place where you are, the place as a welcoming feature where you can feel at ease, that helps you to recover by a good quality, spatial quality, and good green quality. So it's beyond only the water issue. Then the urban goals and ambitions, I take them from the story about identity. A generic grid is the base for the whole city. MCD is a kind of city within the city, but they share the grid as a common feature. The challenge is if you can reinforce the synergy between the medical center and its surroundings. And that's not only about accessibility, that's a technical thing that's very, very important, because this night the roads again were flooded, so that has to be solved. But we should understand this problem of accessibility in terms of a more general connectivity, how the medical center relates to its environment, to its surroundings in the broadest sense. And then again, those elements of transparency and order and porosity of the urban tissue are of importance. Here you see the master plan as it has been done already, with a lot of green elements integrated in the plan, and the expansion, more or less, of the Central Medical District with West Edge, that provides in housing facilities, in more multifunctional use in the surroundings, and also for a great part meant for employees that want to live in Charleston in a nice way. The existing plans, the Greenway central axis is a part of it. It's an east-west axis. I just showed them. There is also already a proposal for a north-south axis along Courtenay, I have to say, oriented to Longley. Here and for Longley, there are already ideas to introduce some amenities that serve for the patients or family taking care of their patients in the Hospital as well, with the marshlands and Ashley River and Lockwood Avenue on the distance. So we think those are very valuable proposals that we should build upon. Besides the qualitative aspects about the atmosphere of the medical campus, it's also about water management, and also there you can see that in the plans of the medical center there are already a lot of elements to integrate water storage, to make the water visible, and to raise the level of the street so they could be free of flooding. Again, very good proposals, and they should be supported. Then we have some recommendations, and those are more or less about reinforcing or enhancing this, those proposals, not only to concentrate not only on the internal cohesion of the medical district, but to extend it and to reinforce the external relationships with the neighborhoods around it as well. So our first proposal is to, or recommendation, is to extend the greenway which is planned here in the direction of Ashley Street, where now the library and a kind of nice formal representative plaza, the front door of the whole campus. So the campus as a whole get better spatial performance as well. A second recommendation is to use Cherry, Bravo and McLennan Street as an additional entrance to the whole area, so it should be accessible from the crosstown highway. But that means that you really should make a comprehensive plan for the public space over there in the middle, that you should also take into account good pedestrian connections from this new entrance to the extended greenway, and that you should make a real good plan how to cross the crosstown development, and to let that not only to the traffic engineers, but to deal with it as an urban feature with urban quality as a public space. That extra access roads can be connected to Hagood Avenue. That road should be elevated to have a safe connection with the higher grounds around the Citadel in the north. But our recommendation is to not only concentrate on Hagood Avenue, but to see that as an element for the multiple or redundant access from the real main roads, because Hagood penetrates in residential neighborhoods. So if that should be a main access road in many cases of emergency, we should just create a new conflict in the surroundings. So our advice is taken to consideration as well, Crosstown and Balloon and the two bridges as well. I will not go too far in detail, this has been considered by others as well. Then, talking about Hagood Ave, we come into a kind of delicate problematic, I think. Here you see Hagood Ave, 4 lanes of concrete with public housing at the edge and an old creek or a relict of a creek at the other side. And you see the public housing of Gadsden Green, also with its isolation by, caused by the crosstown connection. But at the same time, Afro-American community that in the beginning of the 20th century had the possibility to gain properties there as well. And well, I'm charmed by the fact that you here still can recognize the classical Charleston typology with the streets and with the houses and the gardens, with verandas and the gardens, and here the streetscape with the shadowed trees and the perspectives, what is very much lacking in the public housing. So I think the public housing deserves our care, and the Afro-American community around those streets deserves our respect. And so there is a context, if we talk about connectivity between medical district and its surroundings, and that asks also just for good spatial design and for technical improvements. Well, speaking about Hegwood, it's a little bit dangerous because it's very complex, so David, you correct me if I go too far in detail, but this is a kind of exaggerated drawing of the proposal. This is Hegwood at the moment. This is the proposition to raise the level of West Edge and to cover the creek and to replace it by a pipe. And what I'm concerned about is that if you take this literally, then if you even raise Hegwood Avenue, then the contrast between the MDC-oriented interventions and the existing situation are only reinforced. So how can you do this maybe in a better way? This is just a proposal. As a designer, I try to make a kind of solution that more or less can mediate between the different aspects of the whole scheme. Very shortly, the idea is that if you should elevate Hegwood, elevate it in a modest way, and not just to the level of whole West Edge, because then it's 1.5 meters or 2 meters, so you get a kind of mounds you can't even look upon, and then it just reinforces the feeling of isolation. So make a modest elevation, only in the extent that it's necessary for the flood protection. If you elevate Hegwood, combine it with narrowing Hegwood. 4 lanes makes no sense, in my opinion. 2 lanes gives the possibility to introduce bike lanes and pedestrian sidewalks as well. And maybe the most important thing, introduce trees, to make shadowed streets, to refer to the general street typology of Charleston with its nice character, and even the shaded streets within the Afro-American community. And then we think from the point of view of water management, it's quite problematic to, on the place where you have a natural drainage situation, to replace a natural drainage situation by artificial storage. This is complicated because it's influenced by tidal movements as well, so maybe you have to exclude the tidal movements. Of course you have to do something about pollution, but don't cover it, solve it, would be our advice. And the interesting thing that in itself it can be a kind of attractive public space, especially when you make not a steep slope to the west edge, but a gentle slope, so it becomes part of a park space. And then you have an element that mediates between the different elements of the urban environment that can be used for illustration and storage as well. Here I made a little sketch with shadowed tree-lined Hegwood, Gadsden Creek that is kept in its place. Maybe tidal movements are closed off, but the very important thing is that talking about connectivity, we should not only think about connectivity between the north and the south again, but also in the other direction, connectivity between the public housing neighborhoods over here, between West Edge and the Brittle Bank Tower along Ashley River. So make more and more wider connections to the riverside. Well, this is the riverside. doesn't need any explanation, I think, but it's hardly reachable now from within the city. Of course, we meet here the question of the primary line of protection of the seawall that has to be raised, as Peter and Stephen explained. Here you see a little proposal where we propose to use the existing Lockwood Avenue for the protection and not the autonomous line that Stephen explained. Well, that's, as he told, a question to do further research on. The nice thing can be that the marshlands really reach onto the very edge of the city with its ecological qualities. And here you see that, well, the fantasy to lend or to steal a solution from high battery as a high quality solution could be applied here as well. What we discovered while cycling and walking around is that the continuation of such a line along Lockwood Lockwood Drive is quite impossible, because here it's completely dominated by urban infrastructure and highways. I cycled there, I survived. More or less. But so we think it's very rational to add a new parallel line, maybe in the sense as Stephen proposed, under the bridges and along the harbor, so you can have a walk or a cycle tour from here to here. And then we have also to think about connections from the medical district with its own internal east-west axis that could be extended to reach the river, like also the streets here in the urban tissue could be extended to reach the river as well. Well, talking about alternatives and things to be researched, this is another proposal even where Lockwood Drive has been replaced or taken out. This is Long Lake, and here the new defense line even retires to its older positions, giving even more space to the marshlands. And here another image, nice to end with, where Lockwood Drive is still there, where there are marshlands here, but where this autonomous line Stephen proposed goes on along the section.
We've said Mac's name a couple times. Mac Ball was for a long time business partner, and he speculates about whatever that might be. His father's office was right across from that lake for a long time, and he gave a lot of medical care to people in Charleston. So I think that the speculation of the future of these lakes, and are they going to be pump ponds and storage ponds, where do they situate within the natural system and the defended system? There is so much to think about here. It's not a very big city. Janice Barnes is going to come up, Janice, good to see you, and talk about something she led brilliantly, a group to think about how to finance movements how to finance the medical district, some improvements in the medical district as a methodology.
So the inspiration that we see in all the amazing work that the team has shared so far is such a beautiful set of visions for where we could ultimately go to. What we were trying to do with the work in the other workshop, I clearly don't know how to advance this at all, was to say, might we take the medical district as an example of how you look at the place, the pathway between where we are now and where we might need to get to with the kinds of visions that you've just seen and you'll continue to see. So in the breakout group that is, I think the content's still up next door, what we chose initially to do was to look at what is most impacting the medical district on a weekly or monthly basis. So in lieu of tackling the larger sea level rise or the storm surge issues that you've already heard about, we chose to focus on rainfall and tidal flooding. Because the medical district is experiencing such frequent disruptions to such critical services on such an increasingly frequent basis, we feel that this is an important near-term question to solve as we're looking toward the longer-term solutions for Charleston's next 350 years. So what we did was to develop a process, and when I say we, there's a huge team who helped pull this together. So many thanks to all the folks in the room. How many people touched finance in the medical district? Hands up. That's a lot of hands. Thank you all so much. What we did was to create a process to test it against a group that's already relatively codified, right? You have the 3 institutions with an MOU that they put in place in 2015. But this process is important to think about in terms of its applicability elsewhere in the city and in the region. And the process was this: how might we look at the reach that, in this case, medicine provision in this district has? It's not the peninsula, it's not even the city, it is a regional or maybe even a multi-state reach. So understanding the catchment of all the patients, all the services that are provided, really changes the nature of what the influence is. You can imagine the same question in terms of tourism, the same question in terms of logistics or the auto industry. And then we said, how much is the frequency of this rainfall and tidal flooding impacting the ability to provide those services? And what is the value? How might we look at the value of those impacts in terms of the cost to the institutions, the cost to the employees and the employees of the employees who serve those institutions, and the city as it tries to respond in times of need? And then given those costs, what possible solutions might we begin to introduce, both from a near-term perspective for the things that can be done in the next few years, as well as tying into the longer-term perspectives that you've just heard? And then what kind of collaborations need to be put in place to make this realistic so that the work can begin now and lead us toward that long-term future? And you can imagine how this process could be quite replicable elsewhere in the city. So when we looked at near term, we said, what can we do to improve the flood recovery so that you can get the service going again and also improve near-term water storage? Midterm, looking at the connectivity that Fritz was just describing, as well as adding water storage. And then long-term, not only improving the services and the patient experience, but also expanding capacity further to deal with those bigger issues that we just described. And this is important in terms of the opportunity cost. We look specifically, for example, at the Earhart Shaft and what the opportunity cost is in just a few years in terms of the ability to either connect to it or miss that opportunity or significantly increase the cost of that opportunity, not to mention the additional flooding that would be experienced in that time period. And then we said, well, what happens if you compare the two? What might happen if these institutions could quantify their service interruptions in a way that really puts a value on it where possible, qualifies it where it's not? And then how might you look at a combined medical district cost of service interruption? And then how might you multiply that based on the number of years that they have and will continue to have those types of disruptions if significant change is not introduced? That gets to be a pretty big number. And then when you compare that to either the near or midterm strategies or even the long-term strategies, I think that cost comparison actually tells us those strategies are maybe not so expensive. So this is an action that the medical district team will now undertake to quantify those service impacts and to think about that compared to the kinds of strategies that you've been hearing about and some of the nearer term strategies that we've discussed. And then we said, well, how might we pay for that? So in paying for each of those near, mid, and longer term strategies, we mapped out across federal, state, local, and private resources where the money might come from to create unique capital stacks that align with the values of the different financiers and funders in order to get this work moving. And the list at the bottom is just an example of the kinds of places that you can begin to find the funds for that work. And again, the purpose of this is not just for the medical district, but for the catchment that it serves, but also as a model that could be replicated elsewhere in the city.
The Dutch on their stock market have the phrase many of you have heard me say, as I learned, costs come before the benefits. And the costs continue, and you're getting no benefits. So the pattern is inane. But the reach of that project's great. I mean, it's a regional, goes to Columbia, Florence, people need medical care, they're coming from all over. The reach of the next project that Ramiro Diaz is going to come and present is different. It's really the east side, the Bardell to Market Creek area, where we are.
Thank you, David, and thank you for everybody. We had, I think we had a lot of fun working together on this district, and it was very inspiring, and the closest area right there, right outside the window. So very easy for us to ground truth and imagine a future for this area, a new future. So as Pete talked about the system, about the whole peninsula, we started with the challenge of the high ground, and you can't see the colors at all, can you? Great. Okay, so on that screen, it's great. This is a very important diagram that shows that the spine of the city, the high ground, has the greatest influence on the low ground in terms of runoff. If you remember those sections, all the water that falls on the city has to go somewhere. It goes by gravity. It comes off of the high ground, it goes down to the low ground. You have this drainage system underground, the current drainage system. It's tidally influenced, and in the future, if there's a perimeter protection, that condition can change, but you will still need to manage all the runoff from the high ground. So our challenge was, can we not have any runoff from the high ground? Now, this is something that hard to explain sometimes to people, but drainage systems, you know, they're limited by the size of the catch basin and the size of the pipe and the effectiveness of that. Once the system is overfilled, it starts to go across the surface. I'm going to explain, and this is going to kind of explain how the watersheds are developed. It's, you guys understand your topography. You actually have a much hillier landscape than we do in New Orleans, but there's subtle, very subtle differences in the streets that break the water one way or the other, and it all goes down to the river and to the creeks. So when we talk about water volumes, this is a different way of looking at it than maybe most people think about water, but Robert talked about a water assignment, and this was a pivotal thing for us in the water plan in New Orleans, which is thinking about water as something that you can plan for and manage for in a spatial sense. It's a volume, and you need to understand how much space it takes up. Because if you want to try to have this attitude that we hold the water and try not to burden the drainage system, or understand the drainage system will be overburdened, and we need to find a place for that where it falls, you can think about it spatially. Now, I have no idea how big an acre is in my head, right? It's a very strange unit of measure that has to do with farming, and I can't tell you how big they are. I know that it's 43,560 square feet, and I don't know why. So if you think about Marion Square, which you all have a sense of how big Marion Square is, and you fill it up to about my waist height, maybe Stephen's ankle height, that is 20 acre feet. So 20 acre feet is how big Marion Square 3 feet deep is. So this water assignment in a 10-year, 24-hour storm, which is your typical design storm. So think about that for a second. Every 10 years, and probably now every 1 year or every half year, you get storms that over 24 hours you have 6.5 inches. It's actually not that impressive when you think about it hour on hour. Now you may have some peak intensities in there that change that model, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is a lot of water coming down, and it's very hard to manage this much water, but it happens over time. So you can allow that water to flow off in some ways, and sometimes you'll have flooding, but it's somewhat manageable. The storms that I'm more concerned about are the 1 hour events. These are the things that are happening more often. We had an event in New Orleans last week that was 7.5 inches on my street in 2 hours. I had many feet of water down my street, similar to Marion Square, 3 feet deep. And these are the rain bombs or cloudbursts that are happening more and more frequently. You're going to keep having those 24-hour storms, but those volumes don't seem to be increasing as much. We hear from the climatologists, well, you're having more of these events, that in a couple of hours you get intense rain. So you had 1 inch of rain last night, but it came very quickly. You combine that with the high tide, and you have a big problem. We figured out how much is on the high ground and how much is on the low ground, and we went through this math, and that's maybe not so important to this story. What is important is this. This was the mantra for the urban water plan in New Orleans. It's the Dutch mantra as well, that you slow the water on the high ground. You try to get it to go into the ground. If you can reduce the runoff, if you can make the ground less impervious and go slower, you actually change the runoff coefficient in that previous calculation. So you can actually lower the volumes you need to store. And then you store the water, and you do it in a way that you manage it and use it. The canals that Peter was talking about that can help balance groundwater. And then also can provide value to the city, blueways, greenways, and such. And then finally you pump, you drain. Right now, your model is not the pumping so much. You have a few pumps and you have the big deep ones now, but you have that tidal problem, right? So the water's gonna come up. So the more we can do on the high ground, the better, and that's the whole thesis. So we first looked at the streets, and these are the streets. Once again, there's a gray boundary that is, you all know it was on the map earlier that Peter showed, that is coming in and out where the creeks used to be, that's the lowland, coming all around the city. So we traced all the major streets. There are more, we kind of ran out of speed drawing them all, but we figure if you look at the high ground streets first, these are the ones that are above 8 feet. These are the ones that are not going to be tidally influenced right now so much, and have the greatest potential to store water below grade. That's what we're trying to do, is to store water. So we looked at these very closely. You can see that they're not, the networks are not connected. So right here, this is Hugie and King. This is Meeting Street. And so maybe some of those are opportunities to actually raise the street in the future. Or, in this case, we have some solutions for how to manage that flooding. So, the Hugie King Watershed, I don't know what it's actually called, but there's a watershed. It's described by that bowl that I'm sure you all know. There's a Shell station or a gas station here, and the housing project, a really beautiful old one here. Hugie is running this way. This is King Street. So these blue lines are the streets that we're going to talk about. But this is the water assignment for that zone in a 10-year storm. So 2.5 Marion squares, and then 1.25 Marion squares there. There's this natural ridge that's the high ground that comes through this way. It does not follow the low line. It actually comes around this way, and the low line is an artificial ridge. So that's actually impounding water because the creek used to come all the way up through this space and back out. So Newmarket Creek came in here and went back out. What we're talking about with street interventions, given your limited space in your streets, because your streets are quite narrow, as they are in New Orleans and many of the Dutch cities, you need to be very aggressive with how you manage water. These do not need to be continuous solutions. They can be done piecemeal, but ideally they connect together and they connect to your existing drainage network. So these are renovations. First is permeable pavers. These are new technology that are getting better. They can be installed in big sheets, and then individually they can be lifted out and repairs can be made, but they can withstand heavy traffic loads, and I'm assured by the manufacturer they can be used in streets, and that's something to be studied. But they also work in parking lanes very well. Under the streets, we can be doing more aggressive storage, similar to your arches that you have now. These are plastic, but they have also concrete structures and other kinds of structures, and these can store a lot of water. You're trying to get more space. In the sidewalks, plant more trees, plant as many trees as you can, but create a space underground for those trees to have roots. These systems called silva cells or structural soil create kind of a platform underground so that they can have softer, looser soil that can absorb more water, and then the trees are happier and you get more storage. And then where you have space, bioswales or water channels, other types of features that can just move the water. So we did a minimum scenario. This is kind of the easiest to accomplish, which is doing something in the parking lane, doing trees with the silva cells, maybe putting more storage under the sidewalk. We actually maybe should have added that here, but in any case, we calculated how much storage this is in the right-of-way. There's a very complicated chart that I did not put in the slideshow because you can't read it. Too complicated, but what if you do all of those streets that we showed in that previous map, which is a high bar to achieve, but you can manage that much of the water assignment, so 9% of the water assignment, or 18% of the water assignment in the 25-year storm, which is actually pretty impressive. And so that's water that's taken out of the system that does not have to be drained. Then that drains later, and it goes into the ground, which is beneficial. A medium scenario is doing the whole street width in permeable paving, and that's much more impressive, 50% of the 25-year storm, 23%. Once again, this is requiring doing all the streets. This is costly, but it could make very beautiful streets in the end. And then finally, if you start to put stormwater cells under the street and really maximize the storage, and in some places we can go very deep with this because of the height, you can start to actually exceed the storm event, which is a good idea because they're just going to get worse over time. And maybe you start to develop utilities banks under the sidewalk or your kind of data and power and other things that stay dry. So the next layer is the public parcels. There actually aren't very many of the big parks, but there are a few. Marion Square, once again. A couple of the plazas throughout. The gray is missing once again, but some of these are high. So this is on high ground, this is on high ground. The ones in the lower ground would be beneficial for the pumping in the future. But we think that schools and parks and public facilities are the low-hanging fruit that you can do right away and store lots of water in a beautiful way. Using underground detention, using bioswales, using park spaces, water squares, places where you intentionally flood, and then it could be parks later. So the kids in Louisiana love this little park, they run around in the water and then you can play on the field after. Under the highway, at the low line, there's the beautiful old housing development, William Eaton, I believe it is, has a swale already alongside. So these are those brick houses. There's a lot of space on that property. There's space between the trees that can create a really nice space in front. This is that bad intersection that floods all the time. This is the high ground at the low line, which is kind of an odd name, but that's the high ground. So this is a great idea. There's already a drainage plan in place, I believe, for some underground drainage, but we think you can daylight the creek and bring it back through, and this would be a fantastic water storage. We talked to the DOT people, and they were okay with the idea of putting more under the highway. So we think that there's some storage potential here to further help people downstream. And then this identity can actually continue along the low line all the way up and down. Hampton Park, I did not realize it was an Olmsted Park. I'm very happy to hear that. It's a genius. But we hear that this park actually runs off of the neighborhood a bit. So maybe we can come back and sensitively add some space for storage in the park, enhance some of the edges to slow it down a little bit. Parks should not be flooding the neighborhoods next to them. That's, I think is a good principle. But these playing fields that are here that are, could be improved. We hear that they flood actually. You can do aggressive underground storage under the fields, and they're on the high ground, and they would influence this area quite extensively. There's also a school up here, so there's lots of opportunity we see that can be replicated around the region. And this is the storage that was calculated for that zone. Finally, the private property tends to be on the high ground, except the medical district. This is, your intensive, already historic area. What can you do in those areas to store more water? But where you're doing these new developments that are on the high ground, you should be maximizing storage on that. And whether that's through incentives or requirements to increase your stormwater management, we suggest that you study that. But also working with homeowners, incentivizing homeowners to do things, even little small scale measures help with that slowing and storing of the water. So on the private lots, the wonderful side hall, you've got this side Charleston's, I forget the name, I apologize. I'm thinking shotgun in my head. Shotgun houses. Anyway, you have this little garden to the side, and those could be fabulous spaces to store and slow water. Flow through planters are fantastic. These can be many different scales. Green roofs on the big developments, big bioswales. And then this is a nice building in New Orleans that's modern and has stormwater. It's got the permeable paving, it's got the cistern, and the roof is a blue roof. And just an example of what you can do on a commercial building. So finally, the east side neighborhood. Okay, so the guiding principles that we discussed in dealing with this fabulous community is that safety and amenity should be primary, and how you determine what safety is and what the nuisances of flooding versus the safety. Flooding cars is a huge burden to people, not being able to get to work, and then finally needing to be rescued in a storm or God forbid, losing life. So that's primary. But then making it beautiful, something that you can enhance the community. Preserving the community institutions, building upon those institutions. So for example, we have the school building here. This could be a fantastic water management feature that could actually enhance the school's programs. The space around this older school building could be something. The park, the church is here, and the new educational facility that's going here as well. And then promoting affordable housing on the higher ground within the neighborhood. So around these edges, and I've got another diagram in a second that explains that. And then providing tools for residents to shape the future of the community. I'm going to zoom in. We didn't quite get it in New Market Creek. I wanted to do more. We actually addressed it up here. But in the future, New Market Creek is an area that should be studied very carefully. We focused on Bardell's Creek, which people only know that it's there when it's flooding, right? There's a spot right here where the creek expresses itself. There's a kind of emerging wetland back in here. And this is the Cooper Street, which is, the next slide, it's zoomed in. Cooper Street is that connection to the bridge, which we understand is very important. It now has a connection to Meeting Street. We see that as an opportunity for an urban bioswale along the edge and a good stormwater street. A large water square. It does not need to be blue all the time. Maybe it has a flooding opportunity, but then maybe a natural creek that then connects. This is the big parking lot down the hill. Stephen had this fantastic idea to create this alley of trees in that there's a drainage easement that can't be built on along this edge on Lee Street. And then importantly, connecting Lee Street through to East Bay and Morrison, yes. And then between the existing buildings, there's lots of opportunity for storing water on the public housing side, using the new developments that are underway. So we were working within that space to create a new vision. And then finally, a water square or some sort of space that's important where the old tower is from the bridge. In terms of the future of this zone, we had some conversations with the Housing Authority, and we had a lot of conversations within our group, and we were trying to focus on the water primarily, right? Safety and water, but we do believe that these lower areas are not only hazardous, cars are flooding, and it's a very uncomfortable position, and we walked around there, and it's very evident that there's standing water on the street. So in the future, as this area is redeveloped, we recommend that this be very carefully looked at, whether you develop in that zone. Maybe there's some ways to work around with water and create some higher housing, or make it into some sort of park space, but create more room for housing over here first. So this is the public housing. These are the development sites that I believe are private. And so that is a whole process that needs to be very carefully considered so that we can make this area safer. This street potentially could be raised because it's very low, as well as this one. And raising this street does not impact the historic buildings on this street. And finally, this is a view of what this looks like. So here's New Market Creek, Bardell's Creek coming through, and that sort of new meander, and then the water square, and then you can see it coming and connecting to the low line over here with the new developments, and a great site on this edge of the blue-greenway that we see for this area. And then, of course, the school with its greenway. That is all. David.
Okay, we're over long. And we can't ever finish. This work has to go on. It's been about conservation and preservation. It's about adaptation. All these values have to go forward, but you have to understand that water needs to be positioned as asset. If you fight it as enemy, and Robert showed you that, it's not going to get anywhere. Charleston, a city that is built over time and exists over time, is a palimpsest. Written over, written better, drawn better, becoming more beautiful. So the question with Charleston is, well, what's the basis? And Joseph, who affected us greatly. He said, you know, it's the holy city. Well, and then we see this church and the floodwater there, and it can be a holy city, but we're going to have to take care of it. We're really going to have to love it. And so this Love Charleston, Paul, becomes the question. You know, we love it. That's why we got the best Dutch team you can get to come here. You know, because Charleston's lovable, but you've got to take care of it. It's got to come from within you. The will should be there. The ways are there to do this. You know, the church can be raised on the water. The water doesn't have to raise the church. And then there's a new Charleston that is bigger. You know, things aren't immutable. Things are possible. There's a future city here. And we're here to help if we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for being here. You got all that? Yeah. All in favor, say aye. Okay. First, can collectively, I mean, there's so many people here that made up this amazing week of ideas and thoughts and energy. Can I just ask a round of applause for all the engineers, architects, planners, finance, Dutchmen, everyone who's been involved in this. Thank our main partner, Winslow Hasty, and the Star Charleston Foundation, and London. Where are you, London? She's the glue that kind of helped hold a lot of this together. And Winslow, you mentioned our other partners I got early on, so thank you to all of those. Paul Rienzo, remarkable contributions by hosting us Monday night and getting us off to a great start. Dale Marsh, you're incredible. The Water Institute of the Gulf, you're our friend for life. David Wagner, Mac Ball. David is, I feel like you're the conscience of our efforts. And I'll speak to this a little bit more in a minute, but I heard David a few months ago when he talked about having an advocate for water, And I'll come back to that in a minute. Jan Palin, representing the Kingdom of the Netherlands over here. It's so incredibly thoughtful that as a country that they dedicate their expertise in this field as part of their foreign policy. Jan, y'all have made permanent and lasting international friends through your foreign policy. We so appreciate it. I got to tell you, a lot of people in the city and our staff have been working on this and all these issues for quite some time now. But I got to shout out to somebody, and this gets down to the resilience of our city and its long-term resiliency. And Mark Wilford, you've been incredible all the way through. Stand up, Mark. City staff is so energized and been a part of all this. I'm thankful and honored to be working with them. And Ray Huff, thank you for your hospitality here at the Clemson Center. So many people have come together for this. I think a couple of council members were here. We need their support. Councilmember Seekings, he might have slipped out, or is he still here? And Councilmember Gregory, are you here? I heard you were here, and God bless Councilmember Carol Jackson. She's been here all week, but she slipped away to the Municipal Association meeting up, and so she sent a special representative, Libby Smith, to be with us today. So, water, it's an amazing substance. I don't talk about this often, but I was a chemistry major in college. And the properties of water are really quite remarkable. It's one of the few substances where all three phases, solid, liquid, and gaseous, exist within a close temperature range. It's the only substance, not the only substance, but one of the very few substances where the density of the solid phase is less than the density of the liquid phase. That's why your ice floats in your glass, and why when the polar ice cap freezes over, it doesn't sink to the bottom, and otherwise the formation of life, y'all, would have been completely different on the planet Earth, but for the physical properties of this substance, water. We are 60% water as adults. Our brains are over 70% made of water. And when I think of the way that Charleston has treated water over the last 350 years, but for the rice culture, where we were incentivized by economics and agriculture to treat water respectfully. We filled in creeks, we built over marshes. We weren't very respectful of water. And I was thinking of someone, if I were to personify water and the way water has been treated here over the centuries, who would that person be? Came to me this morning that would be Rodney Dangerfield. I just don't get no respect. I just don't get no respect. And I think back to David Wagner's remarks a couple of months ago about being an advocate for water, thinking of it differently than we have as a community, rather than being an enemy, being a friend. We're known as a city to be the #1 in hospitality in the world, right? That means, stay a while. Come and find a place for you here. We haven't done that with water. We need to treat water respectfully and be an advocate for water. And that is what the Dutch has brought to us. A different mindset, a different cultural consciousness of dealing with water, of finding a place for water. In everything we do going forward, given what has happened here with extreme weather and what's coming with sea level rise, that we have to think from our gardens, from our own property, to our public spaces, to our sidewalks and streets, of creating a place for water, being a friend for water, being an advocate for water, giving it a place to reside, giving it a place to rest, rather than just hurrying up and pushing it out to the harbor. Reusing it wherever we can, making the best that we can of this resource. So there's an incredible amount of work to be done, but what we see here today is a vision for a future of protection of our citizens, of our property, so that Charleston, ready to celebrate its 350th birthday next year, will be able to sustain itself for generations to come, for another 350 years. But y'all, we've got to think about the water first. We have to be respectful of water. We have to think about it in everything that we do, from planning to land use to the requirements that we have for future development and redevelopment. If that's not clear for us as a community at this point, I don't know how it will ever become clear. It's clear for us. And it's going to be up for us to go out in our community and raise the awareness of our citizens of this critical issue going forward. That this is a community effort. It's not just something that the city government can wave a wand and can pass a few ordinances and fix. We all have to have this cultural mindset. So I want to again thank the Dutch and your spatial thinking and your planning and your thoughtfulness of systems to bring us this consciousness here to Charleston. It's what we need for future generations. It's what we need for the protection of our citizens and our property and God bless you. I thank you for the amazing week you've given us here. Thank you again.